boast about that I shared a jail cell with, having chatted about architecture in the heroic days of People's Park. Christopher Alexander is professor of architecture at Berkeley. He is an alumni of the GSD, having received his degrees in architecture and in mathematics at Cambridge. He came to Harvard and in 1963 received the PhD in architecture. I believe it is the only PhD degree in architecture this school ever granted. The program was initiated the year he arrived and phased out when he left. He was also a Harvard Fellow, and I researched it today and discovered that only 2 architects became Harvard Fellows through the entire history of this institution. His PhD dissertation became his first book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form. I think Christopher Alexander, throughout his professional life, has always been at the cutting edge, radically re-examining the conventional wisdom of the time. When in the 1950s, the formula of housing projects, the kind of preconceived solution to how people should live, was kind of taken for granted, he wrote, together with Sir Chermayeff, who's with us tonight, Community and Privacy, challenging that conventional wisdom. Then later, when little attention to understanding the design process in architecture was given, and while other disciplines were exploring this issue intensively, the entire issue of human making decision, he wrote, as I mentioned, Notes on the Synthesis of Form. In the 1970s, when we tended to take for granted large-scale bureaucracies and impersonalized institutions, he carried out the Oregon experiment, again challenging the conventional way and pointing out radical solutions. He continued to search for the underlying framework, the fundamental qualities that give place its well-being in the pattern language and the timeless way of building. And as he continued doing all this thing, he always defied stereotyping. As people tended to stereotype him as a person primarily interested in the theoretical aspects of architecture, he set up his own construction company and now both designs and builds within a single organization. And within all that diversity of activity, there has been one unity that has underlined it all, and that is his basic humanism and his concern and affection for people. So for the first time in 19 years since he left Harvard, I'd have the pleasure of welcoming Chris Alexander.
Thank you. Does that work? Is it working? You sure? Does anyone hear anything? Okay, now. Thank you, Moshe. Oh, I've got a very, very difficult task tonight. Can everybody hear me? Because I can't tell. Is this thing working at the back? Yes, okay. For many years, I thought and wrote about things that one could very crudely call functional aspects of architecture. That is, I tried in many different ways to see whether it was possible, by defining all of the minutiae, the small things that are happening in buildings, the small things that need to happen, what's really going on, gradually to build up the form of a building from those kind of considerations. And of course, I'm still absolutely rooted in that attitude. And but I'm saying that as a preface, because the things that I want to talk about tonight are not of that nature. And without making it very, very firmly clear that absolute, thoroughgoing, day-to-day, minute functionalism is at the basis of everything I believe in, the rest of what I'm going to say tonight might easily be misunderstood. Now, what I want to talk about is a huge subject. I can't really do more. I'm going to give a kind of a progress report tonight, I think, because I understand that I have about an hour. I don't know if I'll be able to hold to that. I'll try. Essentially, what's happened is that in the course of thinking these matters through further and further, during the last 5 years, I've come to the conclusion that in order to set our ideas about architecture straight, and in order really to establish a clear picture of what we're doing when we build, it's necessary to make changes in our cosmology. That means in our conception of how the physical universe is put together. I'm using those terms in quite an ordinary sense. I'm talking about really essentially what is generally considered to be the business of physics. We have a certain picture of what's going on in the universe, what kind of a place it is. Largely, that picture has been defined by the broad class of activities we call science. And essentially, the world picture that we have at the moment has been growing for about 300 years, really since the time of Descartes. And we have a certain way of looking at the material world, which, generally speaking, we believe it's a certain kind of place. That is, we believe it's a certain kind of structure. And it's very rarely discussed, I believe, the extent to which our beliefs about that structure enter into what we do as architects or builders. And very, very simply, in a nutshell, I have come to the conclusion, as I'm sure many others have, but it's rarely discussed explicitly, that we cannot get straight about building without changing the picture of the material universe that we have inherited from the last 300 years since the time of Descartes. Now, this is a pretty heavy topic, and it'd be ridiculous for me to attempt to spell it all out in the course of an hour. So that's why I say I'm really just giving a progress report. I'm going to touch very, very lightly on certain issues in the hope that I could build up at least a feeling of what I'm trying to say here. Oh, I just want to say one further thing about Descartes. The genius of Descartes was quite simple. He made the observation, well, of course, with others, but it was principally due to him. So, around about 1600, that if we look at the world and pretend that various little bits of it, some piece of it, were a mechanism, then we can figure out how it works. That doesn't mean that it is a mechanism. It just means that if you pretend that a certain phenomenon that you're interested in is behaving like a little machine or like a little gadget, you can figure out what is tripping what hammer, which is pulling what wire, and so on and so forth, and gradually you will begin to understand how nature works. And Descartes actually said in the early 17th century that if we go on doing this for several hundred years, we will gradually build up a completely coherent picture of how the physical universe works, which was amazing for him to be able to predict that in a sense. But anyway, so this was his genius, that that simple idea created the whole of what we know as science. Now, this idea is all very... My goodness. I didn't know what I was saying was that heavy. This idea is all very well, but it has one rather strange consequence. Can we have some stability in the light system? It's quite disconcerting. The consequence is this. If you ask what kind of order can be understood by these means that have been available to science and that are generally espoused by science, the kind of order that one can understand thoroughly is, if I put it very, very crudely and stupidly perhaps, is the order of a Coke machine. In other words, I'm saying when you have a Coke machine, you put in a quarter, click, 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 various things get tripped and so forth. Finally, out comes the Coke bottle. Now, the order of that machine, that is the way in which one thing leads to another, this causes that, and the overall structure of that machine permits it to behave in the way that it does. That is, all of that kind of order is thoroughly available to us given the mental attitude that we have inherited from these 300 years. Now, there are other kinds of order that are not available to us as legitimate things. A simple example would be a Mozart symphony. Although I suppose most people admire that symphony, recognize it to be something valuable, within the cosmology that we have inherited, it does not have a legitimate structure. What I mean by that is that one would have to dismiss that symphony. If one says, why does it work, or what is wonderful about it, one would have to give rather silly kinds of answers. Well, it creates certain kind of harmony in the cognitive structure of the person who's hearing it, and that sort of thing. But actually, the order of the symphony itself is not describable within the canon that we have inherited. So essentially, although even a physicist, of course, may be a great lover of Mozart, in terms of cosmology, that is, in terms of the picture of the world that we have, the Mozart thing does not fit into it. It's not describable, or it's not legitimate within the universe of kinds of structures that our picture of the world allows us to have. Now, in the physical world, exactly the same is true. That is, those kinds of order or structure which have a clear functional orientation, that is, where a certain thing is made the way it is because it has to perform certain functions, or those cases in nature where we believe that we can describe a certain structure in terms of the reasons that led to its making, all of that is like the Coke machine. And that is the stuff which has been done indescribably well over these last 300 years. But if one wants to say, well, what is the order of a particularly beautiful Chinese vase, which has a very subtle harmony in it, of course, we may all say, well, it's a lovely thing. But again, within the picture of the physical universe that we currently have, that order is not a real phenomenon. That is, it's not describable within the model of the universe that we have inherited. Now, this may sound like a small thing. It may sound like a kind of an esoteric thing. But the point is that all of us here, as makers of buildings, are actually concerned with this matter every single day. And what's happened is that because of the cosmology that is current, and because of the kind of picture of the universe which we believe to be the correct one, we are literally able to see only one half of the order phenomenon. That is, we're quite capable of seeing the order phenomenon as it is related to function. But what I have just characterized as pure order, or the order of the thing, is not actually a graspable matter for us. Of course, we might all have intuitions about it. In fact, most of us do, naturally, if we're concerned with making things. But it's not a fit subject for discourse. There are no real models of what kind of a thing it is. We can't make sense of it to ourselves, as a matter of fact. And furthermore, I mean, it's my belief that because of all of that being missing, people who make buildings today are in an acute, almost one might say agonizing, state of discomfort. Because at some very deep level, basically what you're doing doesn't quite make sense. The functional part of it, you can make sense. Okay, you can say, look, this is solar energy. This is the heating system. We have to get enough daylight in here. This is how the circulation works. All of that's fine. And you can get more subtle about that too, as some of my own past work has tried to show. But since you don't have a clear mental picture of this other stuff, of the order of the thing, it's almost as though that is not a fit subject for discussion. And in fact, of course, we live in a period of architectural thought where I suppose one could crudely call it everybody is free to do his thing. In other words, one person's values are these values, another person's values are those values. One design instructor will lead you to believe that a certain kind of building is the right thing, another one that another is the right thing. One professional architect will make one kind of building, another one will make another. And this is all regarded as being essentially in the realm of personal preference or sometimes cultural idiosyncrasy. And the idea that one might actually be talking about something substantial is really ruled out. In fact, it's even considered, I don't know if that's true in this particular school, but in most places that I know, it's considered slightly obscene to propose that these matters might be of an objective sort, because it appears to be an infringement of each person's sacred personal individuality. And as a result, the whole vast area of order itself is essentially ruled out from our discussion. Now, when I said that in order to get straight about this and in order to try to get clear pictures of what I'm talking about, it will be necessary to revise one's picture of the physical universe. Of course, I'm not saying that anything about the physics, biology, chemistry, and so forth that we have built up is in itself wrong. I think most of those things are miraculous achievements, incredibly wonderful, really, that we have broken through so many barriers there. But there are assumptions involved which have carried forward that mechanism idea of Descartes, which actually force us to be blind to this phenomenon. I mean, in fact, the idiosyncratic nature of value is one of the things that comes with the 20th century view of science. That is, it's not merely said that value is something that science will not deal with, but it's kind of explicitly become a dogma that it must be an individualistic, sometimes culturally relative thing, which cannot be talked about in a coherent fashion, because that is actually needed to prop up the mechanistic notion of science that is being carried forward. Now, that's a very, very difficult subject, and I don't think I can go into detail about it. But the point is that there is a real connection there. And so the things which I'm going to try to talk about tonight are very, very hairy in the sense that they will and do meet tremendous resistance, because when one understands them thoroughly and when one begins to delve into the kind of truths that I'm going to sketch out, very, very hair-raising paradigm conflicts come into play. And the one thing is just not compatible with the other. Oh, and I should say very quickly that, of course, the actual consequences of the kind of thoughts I'm expressing for design, that is the physical nature and appearance of buildings that can be made or would be made within the worldview which I'm going to try to sketch out, I mean, they are quite different physically from the buildings that we are in the habit of building right now. So this is not idle talk. I mean, this is not merely some nice intellectual thing. If what I'm talking about turns out to be correct, it will radically alter the physical shape of buildings as we know them. Now, one little extra thing that I wanted to say, which is kind of a cameo of the same idea, but it catches it in a quite simple way. You know, famous Adolf Loos, my countryman, made his ornament as a crime statement about 80 years ago. And the role of ornament in building in these decades is highly peculiar. It's not comfortable. That is, many architects feel quite uncomfortable dealing with it at all. Now there's some sort of a movement which is beginning to deal with ornament, but somehow in a very, very funny, awkward way, which has peculiar emotional overtones and sometimes almost a touch of nastiness. And anyway, the point is that if I put ornament in one hand and function in the other, and you say to yourself, well, suppose let's try and make a building that has both these things in it, or let's try and address both the kinds of issues that are involved. You're in a terrible bind deep down in your mind, because the two issues will be done for two entirely different reasons. In other words, if you do functional things, you know that you're doing for common sense reasons. You want to make this passage wide enough so that it's just pleasant to walk down and not too expensive. You want to make that window so that it brings the light in just the right way. That's one kind of argument, which makes sense to us. It's actually pretty straightforward, and one can think about it very well. Now, if you ask yourself, why am I making ornament? It doesn't go down to the same roots. That is, whatever reason there is for doing it doesn't come from the same place. I mean, of course, one can construct some thing about that it's a psychological need comparable to the other needs, but that really doesn't cut the mustard. I mean, the fact is that if you do, let's say, formal things with a building, I'll stop calling it ornament for a moment. Whatever your reasons are for doing that don't come from the same universe of discourse as your reasons for doing functional things. And that fact, very uncomfortable, I think, to a person who thinks seriously about these matters, comes from the same split or the same picture of the universe that I was describing a moment ago. Now, So that a very, very simple way of formulating the problem that I want to explain tonight is to say, what would it be like to live in a mental world as an architect or as a builder where one's reasons for making something functionally and one's reasons for making something a certain shape or in a certain ornamental way are actually coming from precisely the same place in you. Precisely the same place. Now, we don't have a picture within which that's actually possible. I'm going to suggest, well, again, just really sketching out a progress report. I have come to the conclusion, for reasons that I'll only very partly be able to explain tonight, that actually the order of space is prior to the issue of function. That is, in other words, although functional issues are overwhelmingly important, the root matter has to do with order in space, and that there are ways of getting hold of that issue which are so deep that they cover the functional issues, but they turn out to be more fundamental. And in fact, they have the ornamental stuff and the formal stuff as byproducts of them. So that's what I'm really getting at tonight, is the existence of a level of thought or a level of reality where order in space is such a deep phenomenon that it's capable of generating all our activities as architects or as builders, and that function, ornament, and what have you will all come into play as byproducts of that level of observation and thought. Now, I'm going to show a few pictures now. These are examples from various different fields, from various different kinds of artifacts, of things which possess deep structure. And I want to show them simply because I would like to draw attention to the fact, first of all, that we are not making things like that at the moment. And secondly, that there is a kind of structure that one can perceive in these things which is somehow common to all of them. Now, that part is going to be very, very hard for me to communicate, really. I'm just going to whiz through a few slides, and I'm going to ask you to pay attention to the possibility that somehow the same kind of structure is visible in all of them. But that structure, by the way, this structure that I want to talk about is not very obscure. I mean, I can easily put a name on it. I can call it wholeness if you want. We can call it many things. It's quite difficult to name it very well. But anyway, I'll just call it wholeness for the time being, and I'm going to show some examples of physical things that have this deep kind of wholeness in them, and then we'll just talk a little bit about what sort of structure they have. So, Susan, could I, yeah, let's see, okay. We'll just go through these. Where do I have control of this stuff? Is it the left-hand one of these buttons? Okay. I'm going to show these pictures without comment, I think. This happens to be a tantric painting. Nothing happened. Did I press the right thing? Oh, I went backwards probably. Hold on. Okay. This is a very famous tea bowl that was made in Korea. Oh, wait a minute. Excuse me. Could I have the lights on again for a second? I forgot. I want to say one thing about these. I better say this before I show the pictures. There's a rather peculiar kind of test that one can apply to these. You know, we live in a world so confused and with so many different styles and attitudes and all of that, that somebody might easily, on seeing a set of pictures, somebody could say, well, what's so great about those? Or anyway, or you happen to like those and I happen to like these, and all that stuff. So I want to just mention an empirical criterion which happens to correlate with some of the artifacts that I've picked out here. This is a peculiar criterion. If you like, it's a criterion of wholeness, but it is intended to transcend personal likes and dislikes, attitudes, trips, and so forth. What this test says is the following. If you're comparing a couple of objects, I mean, they might be two buildings, they might be two doorknobs, two windows. Ask yourself which one of them you would be more willing to take as a picture of your own deepest self. Now, again, well, I'm just going to say a word more about that. Of course, it's a peculiar kind of a question. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense on the face of it. But if I just say, well, anyway, even though it doesn't make too much sense, just please do it. You can do it with very, very simple objects. I mean, you could do it with a ketchup bottle and a salt shaker sitting on a table in the cafeteria. And you simply say, okay, fine, which of these two objects is, if I have to pick one of them as being a picture of my true self, which one will I pick? And when I say picture of myself, I mean all of you. I mean your bad parts and your good parts, the past and the present, the funny side of you and the horrendous side of you, the whole thing. And one of these two is supposed to be a better picture of that whole thing than the other one. And then please pick one. Now, the empirical fact, which is rather remarkable, is that to an overwhelming degree, people agree about the answer to that question. That is why it is capable of cutting through issues about, I like this, I'm a fan of Mies van der Rohe, I'm this and that, so forth. All of that is irrelevant, because if you ask this question truly, the agreement is extremely strong, and it also is cross-cultural, surprisingly. It's very surprising that the agreement is high even within a culture. It's even more surprising that the agreement is high cross-culturally. But that is so. So that already tells us that we're dealing with a phenomenon, a very profound phenomenon, deeply rooted in human nature. Whether it's rooted in anything outside human nature, we'll discuss in a minute. But anyway, so the pictures that I'm going to show you now, these few pictures, are things which come very, very far in terms of being that kind of thing. That is, they, if put side by side with other things, will tend to almost, I mean, immensely often turn out to be the better picture of your whole self. So let me just go back now to showing some of these pictures. Can I have the lights, please? Do I control the lights too? No. All of these examples that I'm showing are essentially from traditional or historical society. Is that in focus? I can't even tell. is North African tile work. Part of a small Romanesque church, Switzerland. It's a brick tower in Afghanistan. This is the Aladdin Mosque in Konya, Turkey. The Turkish prayer rug. I'm very fond of ancient carpets. I've learned an immense amount from them about this kind of structure that I'm speaking about. The inside of a Persian bowl, I think from the 9th century. Shaker cabinet, chest of drawers. It's an illuminated manuscript. I don't know when it was made, probably about the 10th century in Ireland or somewhere. Japanese tea stand. That's a tiny thing, just a few inches across. I think that's the last one in that series. Yeah, okay. Now, of course, very easy to recognize that these are all wonderful things, and each one of them a great work in its own way. Kind of peculiar that we don't know how to do this. I mean, it's an unusual period of history where we have not been able to take our place in this 1,000-year-long sequence of human creation. Because I think I can say rather categorically that the objects that we are making at the moment do not have this structure. I'm going to, in order to just drum that point home, I'm going to show a few more pictures like this side by side with comparable. These are all examples of building now, but side by side with examples of contemporary building. Again, I mean, it's far too short a time to really argue the point, but anyway, I will state categorically that the works of our time simply do not belong to that family of things that I've just shown, in the sense of penetrating deep into the human person, in the sense that I try to describe. Are you all set up with the split slides? Okay. Can we have the lights, please? Now, if you can can you operate the left projector until the first slide comes up there? Okay. This is a small part of a garden in Nara. This is Barragan's Towers in Mexico. Now, I am making the statement, in each case, what I'll show, that the structure that I'm talking about exists in the left-hand object and does not exist in the right-hand object, no matter how much this object may be revered in our immediate decade. That is Tangier City Hall, and over on the left, a part of the cathedral complex in Pisa. If, in case you find yourself in any sort of doubt and you're wondering whether I'm just romantically showing nice old things on the left and 20th century things on the right, and I'm just on some kind of historical kick, please ask yourself this question that I mentioned. That is, to what extent would you be willing to take that as a picture of your own truest self? And to what extent would you be willing to take this as a picture of your own truest self? And please ask yourself that question with each pair of slides, and I think you'll get my point very, very fast. That is one of the temples at Paestum, and this is a construction by Robert Stern. I believe based on Doric columns. I'm not sure it's the right way up. I think it is. That's an ordinary house somewhere in Cumberland in England, I think, and this is one of Watney's houses. That is the Great Mosque in Isfahan on the left, and this is the Salk Institute. The Belvedere Garden on the left and the Piazza d'Italia on the right. This one, I think, the right-hand thing, the Ford Foundation building, is actually, of all of these slides, probably the most pleasant, in the sense that one could say, well, actually, that's rather a nice place. It's quite okay there. Why are you putting that up there? But again, I want to draw attention to the fact that my intent here is not merely the question about whether it's pleasant and is it quite a habitable space and so forth. My intent is, can you address what you see there and say, is that a picture of myself? And can you do it with the object on the left, which is a Romanian farmhouse? This is an interesting case. This is Kresge College in Santa Cruz on the right here. And I'm showing it because what they would have us believe is that this is sort of like that. But it isn't. Another case rather similar, I think Palladio's building here that is actually does not score particularly high on the dimension that I'm mentioning. I mean, it's all right. But it certainly scores one hell of a lot higher than this, which I believe is intended to resemble Palladio's work in some fashion. This is another one of Barragan's works on the right, called, amazingly, The Fountain of the Lovers. And the other thing is the Rialto Bridge in Venice. That's one of Mises' early buildings in Detroit. And actually, I don't know about the date. I'm not quite sure. And that is one of the monasteries in Mount Athos, Greece. Okay, I think we've gone far enough with all of that. Now, these two cases are both do have this structure, and I put them up here just because I want to talk them for a moment. This is the plan of the Alhambra, and this is the plan of one of the great masonry barns in Europe. And actually, I think I'll switch those off and just talk for a moment, and then we perhaps just switch them on again. Now, my point, I want to be really clear about this, because if I'm not clear about this point, then this whole lecture is going to just go up in smoke. I mean, please believe, after all of the years of intellectual effort, which I have exercised, much of it public, that I am just not kind of romantically just showing nice pictures here and claiming something about it. The point is that there are certain deep structures which are present in the stuff that I've been putting over on the left, and these deep structures are just not present in the stuff that I've been putting up on the right. Now, of course, it remains to be discussed and argued whether these deep structures are important or not. But I think even just from going through the series of pictures, if you turn your mind in that direction, you can see that there is a structural issue involved. Now, of course, the next question is, can we say anything about what these structures are? Can we be explicit about it at all? And the answer to that is yes, I believe we can. See that there is a structural issue. Now, of course, the next question is, can we say anything about what these structures are? Can we be explicit about it at all? And the answer to that is yes, I believe we can. Again, time is too short here for me to do an adequate job of explaining this, but I, after thinking carefully about this for a number of years, been able to identify somewhere around about a dozen, something between a dozen and 15 different structural properties that repeatedly exist in all the kinds of objects that I've shown on the left, and they happen to be largely or almost entirely missing, of course not always totally missing, but largely missing in the kind of objects on the right, which I'm just using what's on the right here as a sort of a quick cartoon way of saying our own time, and that is the stuff that we are in the habit of building or designing. These structural features are not very obscure. They include, I'll just give a couple of examples, very, very quick ones. One of them is that whenever there's an entity, when I say this cautiously, this is statistical. I mean, not whenever, but much of the time. When there's an entity, it will be surrounded by a boundary that is large compared with the size of the entity which it bounds. You give an example. I just give a series of examples of that. For instance, I'm just going to give ordinary functional examples from architecture now. Let's say a courtyard which is bounded by an arcade that is a deepish structure, roughly, compared with the size of the courtyard. A window which is bounded by a frame that very, very substantially forms a transition between the wall in which the window is set and the actual sash of the window, or the glass frame. Those kind of things are, could you just put up the two slides that are in the projector right now? You see it in the Alhambra quite repeatedly in the plan. I mean, for instance, if you look at the great tower up there at the top of the drawing, you see the immense walls and the very, very deeply set window niches in it. that thing is a boundary to that space in precisely that way. Or if you look at the sequence of small rooms that surround each of these two great courtyards, well, in this one, there are arcades. In that one, there aren't. But even behind the arcades, there are rooms, a whole structure of rooms which function as a boundary to that courtyard in the way that I'm meaning. Now, the phenomenon, the only thing that's interesting about these properties, because as I say, they're rather simple and obvious. What one has to, in order to understand them properly, you have to understand that they are happening at every scale. They're not just happening once, for instance, at the scale I've just described them. They are happening to the bricks. They're happening to the roof tiles. They're happening to the edge of the roof. They're happening to the doorknobs. They're happening to the windowsills. They're happening to the pieces of whatever tile that the floor is made out of. Everywhere you look, the structures that exist have boundaries following the kind of rule that I've just said. Now you can see, just from thinking about that for a moment, that that one simple rule suddenly generates a colossal amount of structure. Now I should say that this amount of, I mean, in these particular cases you might say, well, the structure is there for functional reasons. Certainly when I say it's arcade surrounding a courtyard, that's kind of like that. This phenomenon, though, has nothing to do with function, especially. It does occur repeatedly in functional contexts. I mean, another example, let's just switch to biology for a moment. A cell has a very, very thick cell wall, physically, in dimension. The reason is that an enormous amount of chemical interactions are going on between the cell and the fluid that the cell is working in. And these interactions take a terrific amount of space, which needs the volume of that very, very fat boundary as a structure in order to allow it to happen. There are many, many functional examples like that. Obviously, let's say any river has at its edge a zone. Well, there are a series of zones. I mean, there's a zone, for instance, where the viscosity of the water and the turbulent flow start to change. So you have a kind of boundary layer in the water itself, and then the riverbank, ecologically speaking, has a series of zones, and the whole of that constitutes a very, very fat boundary to the mainstream of the river. So the kind of thing that I'm talking about does occur repeatedly, both in architecture and in nature. But the point is that it also occurs in structures that have no apparent connection with function whatsoever. I don't know if you can remember back in the first series of pictures I showed, for instance, in the tantric painting that I showed at the very beginning. I think it's too hard to go back to it. But anyway, those simple rectangles, remember the three simple rectangles, were surrounded by a series of lines that formed enormously complex boundary layers. Or in the picture of a carpet that I showed, the prayer rug, again, I mean, boundaries are just repeatedly present, not only the main boundary of the carpet itself, but at every level of structure, there are these complex imbricated boundaries. Okay, so there are about a dozen of those kinds of properties. Another one I'll just mention very briefly, not the same, is a thing that I call alternating repetition, which is different from just simple repetition. We're very familiar with simple repetition. It occurs all the time, especially in industrially made buildings. Alternating repetition, one might describe as two sets of repetition alternating with each other, so that not just the thing is repeating, but the space between the thing is repeating, or some other structure is repeating, interlocked with the first. Now, for instance, there's a simple example of it here in the outside wall of this barn, where you see the windows and the buttresses alternating in that way. So you've got two kinds of repetition that are alternating and interlocking with each other. It's not a particularly good example, but I have it up there for the moment anyway. So again, it turns out that that alternating repetition is a highly pervasive phenomenon. It exists throughout these kinds of structures. Now remember, please, that when the things that I'm mentioning, I've essentially, if you want to call it, cataloged them or identified them largely by studying structures of the type that I showed in the first set of slides that seem to have very, very deep qualities of this mirror of the self type. Now we're entering into somewhat heavier water. I just want to think this I mean, I'm asking you to go along with me and assume that what I'm saying is true. And of course, you can't ultimately assume it, but just for the sake of argument. If we find that there's a class of structures with a relatively small number of properties that appear, when those properties congregate, they appear to have this very, very deep unity. Or anyway, the thing that I've so far called, they allow you to say, yes, this is a very good picture of my deepest self. But if the phenomena in question crop up, not merely in works of art, where one might expect a direct connection with the human self, but if they also crop up for apparently quite functional reasons, like the ones that I've given in the case of the courtyard, the arcade, and so on and so forth, or if they also occur in natural systems like the cell and the river, then you suddenly don't quite know how to categorize this phenomenon. In other words, the order that I am describing, if you think about it long enough, will suddenly appear to exist in a realm that is not very accessible to description. I mean, that is, you say to yourself, well, why should these structural properties and why should this particular kind of structure recur under these circumstances? Or what is it that is profound about this kind of structure? And actually, we don't have really good answers to this. It appears to be both out in the world and also here inside the human self. And when I said that some of the conclusions that need to be drawn from all of this will make it necessary to challenge or revise our pictures of what's going on in the physical universe, this is certainly one of the ways in which we are currently quite trapped. I mean, the idea that a phenomenon could be objective, that is, could be objectively true as a structural fact about things out there, but could at the same time have some kind of connection with the inner self of the human soul, is a very, very peculiar kind of situation. I don't mean it's actually peculiar, I just mean it's peculiar within the model or within the worldview that we currently have. It's actually prohibited, if you want to put it quite boldly. I mean, in other words, it's not an acceptable concept. So this is hairy water. I believe that it's true. But you can see anyway that we are getting into very, very deep water. Now, of course, when one discovers 12, 15 properties of a certain sort, which are structural properties that appear to characterize a class of structures, then you say to yourself, well, what is going on? What are these properties? I mean, where do they come from? What's the meaning of them? And quite simply, the conclusion that I've come to, I don't know if it's the right way to explain it, is that they are essentially the different ways in which space can be glued together to become whole. But in other words, space is not a neutral medium. See, again, what we've been taught by physics is that space is essentially a neutral medium. Of course, value doesn't enter into physics and so forth. But suppose that it is the case that space, in an absolute sense, can be either more whole or less whole, and that there are certain kinds of structural features that can appear in space which have the capacity to bring harmony or wholeness into the space, that is, to glue the space together. Then what you have is, when structures have these kinds of properties, you can get a progressively more and more profound gluing together, and that's the thing that we recognize in these great works that we've just been looking at a few examples. But then it suddenly becomes an entirely different matter. I mean, this now, if what I'm saying is even approaching the truth, this is an entirely different matter from simply saying, well, you know, this is, I mean, here's some nice historical examples. We're just doing our thing because this is the 20th century now and we can't be bothered with stuff like that. Or anyway, it's impossible. I mean, we can't make things like that anymore. I mean, all of that would suddenly become totally unacceptable if what I have just said were true. Because if it's true that space has the capacity to be more whole or less whole, and there are real structural properties that have the capacity to glue it together more or less, both in a functional sense and in a deep sense, I mean, then of course, in some way, one would start to confront a kind of moral imperative that that is what we're supposed to be doing when we make something, to glue space together like that. And again, please remember what I said at the beginning. I'm not discussing functional issues tonight, hardly at all, because well, anyway, just in time. I mean, I'm sketching over this thing so fast as it is, but please understand, I'm not talking about this in a formal sense. It includes the formal things, but it also includes all the functional things. But it's simply that within the framework I'm talking about, there's a way of looking at the functional things where you see them as gluing space together as well. They're not outside stuff where you do all these functional things or you meet all these goals and therefore you produce this kind of form. Your main purpose is in this gluing together of space, and if you succeed in it and if you understand it correctly, all of the functional issues fall into place correctly. Let's come out and think. Now, suppose you want to do something about all of this. Of course, another very important question that you ask is, well, how do you produce something which has this unity of space or this kind of wholeness or this glued together quality? How do you actually go about making something like that? Now, it turns out that the kinds of things that you have to do in order to make something like that are not like the kinds of things that are permitted in present-day professional architecture. I mean, it's as bold as that. It's quite simple. For example, when you're making a building, there's a very, very subtle process of fine-tuning that is going on constantly throughout the making of the building. And there is no way of accomplishing that subtle fine-tuning by making a set of drawings and then whizzing them down the street to the contractor. Because he's not going to do that. And if you're not doing it, no one's going to do it. And the thing that you've handed over in the form of a set of drawings is basically a lifeless object. It cannot have this structure in it. I'm saying, again, I'm skating so fast. I mean, I'm sorry not to be able to go into this in more detail. But anyway, when you examine it closely, it turns out that you simply cannot produce these structures in that way. It takes enormous concentration, constant attention, and you do actually have to make the thing. So this is one of the reasons why, several years ago, I became a general contractor, because I realized that there was absolutely no way to get anywhere close to this by functioning in the normal framework of professional architecture. And that's been a very, I mean, I'm sort of making a quick transition now into just practical matters of everyday life. And I mean, that's, of course, a serious undertaking and quite difficult. And even after several years now, I'm still only in a position to make very, very small buildings. And am just now, for the first time, embarking on some large projects, because the methods involved, I mean, it's not just a question of being a contractor, having a contractor's license. The point is that the whole procedure of construction, even the kind of construction contract which is written, the way in which the people that are working on the site actually produce the building, I mean, all of that has to change. And I mean, it's hair-raising just to do that in a building that would be from here to there. I mean, it's very, very difficult given what we're used to doing. So to do it in a big building is a tremendous undertaking. I'm about to do it now for the first time on a really large project in Japan, which is about, I guess, 130,000 square feet or something. It's a small university. And I hope I can bring it off. Because really, I mean, so far I've just been doing it on very small projects. And in fact, what I'm going to show you in a minute are barely little sketches of things that have been made with this attitude and with this kind of understanding. And I want to say, before I start showing these pictures of little fragments of my own work, that I mean, compared with this awesome magnitude of the things that I have been speaking about, these little things that I'm going to show now are just drops in the ocean. I mean, they're, of course, nowhere near approach the quality of the things that I've just been showing on the slide so far. And I suppose that it would be several generations before all of us collectively could again arrive at a point where we were able to make things like the ones that I've just been showing. So please don't make any misunderstanding about that. I mean, in fact, I put myself at a tremendous disadvantage in a sense because I'm going to show my few little attempts now. And you've been looking at the great works of human history, you know. But the point is that if we want to get anywhere near the kind of stuff that I've been showing, I believe these attempts have got to be made in a serious fashion. And as I say, I think it'll take several decades of work before we will be able to produce things even remotely like those. So, how am I doing for time? I feel I'm going on too long already. What time is it? 7:10. Okay, so I will now go very, very rapidly through a bunch of slides. I think probably because of being 7:10, I won't talk about them hardly at all. I'll just show them as pictures. And you'll see a few little fragments. Some of them are amazingly tiny. The first picture that I'm going to show is a thing about this big. And I will talk about that one. And and then I will go quite quickly through a whole bunch. Are we back? Are you going to center this set, please? Okay. Now, this is a step. And I actually was after a visit to the baptistry in Florence. I was thinking about all that beautiful black and white marble work that are on the floors there, and whether or not there was a technique by which I felt that there must be some kind of really simple technique of doing things of a comparable nature. And what this is, I'll just explain it to you. This is very crudely made terrazzo. In other words, it's just cement and marble dust. And the way that I make the patterns is by, well, in the upper case, for instance, a little chase there was a piece of styrofoam that was left in that slab when it was troweled off. Okay, pull out the styrofoam, and then you have a sort of a channel there, and also that diamond there. Then take some more styrofoam and just glue it down where all the black things are. You see, in other words, make the design of the black just out of a little piece of styrofoam. Pour in some white cement and marble dust, the white terrazzo. Grind it off when it's green, after about 24 hours, maybe a little bit lower, 36 hours. And then take a torch and burn out all the styrofoam. You can just very hot torch, you can just burn it right out like that. And then suddenly you've got holes where all the styrofoam was, and then you come back with the black marble dust and cement. And after that's gone, about 36 hours, you just grind that off and then polish the thing, and there you are. Actually quite easy to do. In many, many cases, to make things that have this, I've found it's necessary to invent completely new ways of actual physically doing things. That is, that the physical methods of construction that we have evolved are very awkward and don't lend themselves quite. The technology is around. In other words, actually what's possible technically in terms of the chemistry and the tools that are available and what the materials that you can buy, there's fantastic opportunities to be inventive. But the actual, what you might call the sweets catalog of what can be done in construction is almost no help whatsoever in making the kind of things that I'm talking about. So that's one of the other reasons actually I became a contractor, because it was just a constant daily process of experimenting with different ways of building things. Okay, the next series of photographs is of a building I built in Austria a couple of years ago called the Linz Cafe. There's a book about that, so some of you may have seen these pictures already or similar ones. Whoops. What happened there? I think I'll just show these without comment so we don't have to keep everybody away from this stuff. One of the things I like in that picture, I don't know if you can see it, are the little green ornaments up at the top of the wall. There's a series of booths here. I think there are probably going to be more pictures of them. I did all this painting a couple of days before the building was open. Went around very quickly. Colors took a long time to get them right. Close up. I think that's all of that building. See, where are we at now? Oh yeah, this is a project. These are some houses that we built in Mexico a few years ago. This was just briefly, a project where families laid out their own houses within the framework of the pattern language. And we ran a construction yard. Actually, we had a manufacturing yard too. We manufactured special kinds of blocks and so forth to produce these buildings, and then built them with the families. So this was one of the early days when we were laying the whole thing out with the families. And there are all kinds of. I know there isn't time, so I won't try to describe all the construction techniques involved. This is essentially a lightweight basket of wood strips covered with burlap and chicken wire, and then it has a concrete shell about 1.5 inches thick that's hand applied over the top. That's a very interesting building. Oh, what's that, a collage of different. I think this is just from while the construction was going on. I couldn't find the slides just before I came inside. These blocks are actually soil cement blocks. They're largely adobe, but with enough cement in them to stabilize. One of the householders at the time her house was finished. Simple floors. Okay, it's the main entrance of one of the building complexes. Very cheaply made. These houses cost about $3,500 a piece. Okay, let's see, what have I got next? Oh, yeah. Okay, this is a building which is under construction right now, so I just got a few drawings and sketches of it. And it's is that slide backwards? Yeah, it is. Okay. It's a house on a rather steep slope with a lot of very beautiful white oak trees. And so in order to leave all the oaks exactly where they are, the house is being built. There's a series of quite small buildings that are connected by terraced walks and stepped ways and so forth. There's actually 7 buildings in all, but it's a tiny house. And as I say, it's under construction right now, so all I can show you is some of the early sketches of the thing. Even these communicate something, because in many cases we build from drawings that are not much more precise than this. That's the plan of 3 of the main rooms of the building. Very interesting construction technique, by the way. This thing is being built. It's 6 by 6 posts and beams to carry vertical loads, and a 1.5-inch concrete shell carrying all the shear forces on the outside of the building. It's extremely hot country where it's being built. So there's a combination of the inside is wood. It's very beautiful wood and wood paneling also, and the outside is masonry. And it's, from an engineering point of view, rather fascinating and highly stable kind of structure in earthquake country. This was a shot I took when we were putting the foundations in. The building's way beyond that. I mean, the building's about 3/4 complete right now, but that's the only photograph I had with me. That was one of the drawings submitted to the building department. These are a set of tiles that I made, which are now in the foundation. In other words, I just took these the day after I fired them, but they were glued with double-sided tape to the inside of the formwork of the foundation, so that now, as you look at the base of the building, there are these small blue diamonds all the way along. Well, that's just a sketch of the paneling inside. Here's one or two projects of furniture that I've built, or small objects, because I find it very, very useful to kind of work these things out in miniature by making things that are on quite a small scale, and then gradually enlarging the feelings that one develops and the techniques up to the size of buildings. I mean, there's just a little tiny tray in which I actually worked green oil paint right into the grain of the wood after it was finished, and then French polished it. Kitchen canter that I built in someone's house. The music cabinet I was building at the time it was being built in my workshop. And cabinet. Small bedside table. So I got that. Oh, mind about that. Okay, now I've got a series of. I'm gonna keep falling over this thing. I've got a series of just 1 or 2 shots of construction experiments in our yard. This was a technique, for instance, I was developing to build balustrades. Quite a simple idea. Actually, in this particular case, I just formed the thing in 2 pieces of sheetrock with a styrofoam cutout to form the arches. And in this case, poured it. And the thing was actually just glued together and held together by wire. I mean, it's very, very important in a lot of this work to be able to do the thing cheaply, because if you work to current American standards of construction, then you start to get ruled out, because there's a kind of finickiness about modern construction, which will not permit you to do the right thing, because it's spending the money in the wrong place, and the labor costs go too high. So you have to find ways of doing things that are very, very fast. Anyway, so this, I'll show you what a completed balustrade looks like in a minute. Other ones that I've made have actually been shot with gunite. In other words, where you just do it on one side. You staple essentially pieces of styrofoam to a backing, and then shoot it, and then produce a balustrade of the same kind of thing. That was just what the form looked like before it was. This is another place where just a series of construction experiments. All of these, we've been doing a lot of work in shot concrete or gunite, with the idea that one can build very, very cheap, simple guide work, not form work, because it doesn't have to withstand the pressure of wet concrete. The gunite is stable at the moment it's shot in place. So again, the thing is much cheaper, and you can use 1x material, 1x2s, styrofoam, even cardboard, masonite, and so forth, as guide work, and actually produce things. So these were some early experiments. I'm showing this only to stress the fact that I believe in order to succeed in this attitude, one's approach to construction has got to be extremely, what should I say, very, very down to earth and experimental on an everyday level. I mean, you just can't work with the sort of prevailing techniques all the time, I think. That was just that was a sketch, a very, very crude sketch of a construction system at the time that we were doing these gunite experiments, to find out what sorts of things one would like the gunite to be able to do. This is one of these gunite houses under construction right now, and that's what the guide work looks like at the time before it's shot. This is another example of a similar sort of thing. It's just I'm sure everyone's heard of Count Rumford, and he's the man who figured out how to make fireplaces work. So I thought it'd be interesting to try and produce a Count Rumford fireplace, again, very, very cheaply and simply. And here we just cut some pieces of plywood and staple them together and tape them, and then we're able to pour a fireplace around this thing amazingly fast and cheap. I mean, absolutely competitive with the most ordinary metal fireplaces that you can buy. That's how that thing looked when it came out. That's one of the balustrades that I was talking about. That particular one was shot rather than poured. That building was entirely shot with well, a strange photograph. The inside is vaulted. Every single thing in this building is concrete. The whole thing is shot, except the window stack. That was just a sketch about the coloring of that building. This is a model of something that will not be built, unfortunately. It was the client in New York asked us to build a very large complex of restaurants and cafes on the Hudson River, and I always liked this project, so I just chose 3 pictures of the model of it. This building was intended to be shot as well. This is a 10-story building that we're about to build in Japan. On this one, I will not be the contractor because I don't have enough experience to do it. So I'm trying to, hoping to get into a kind of arrangement with the general contractor that will allow me to approximate the kinds of things that I've been describing. The other project in Japan that I mentioned before, we will be, in fact, contracting the thing. But this one is a bit too much for me. And this building contains about 45 apartments. which are all, every apartment is different. And actually, I didn't bring the plans. I should have shown pictures of the plans, because the plans are very interesting. The way of finding a simple and elegant structural system which will allow tremendous variety in the individual apartments. These are some more tiles. Show the picking tiles. I like making tiles very much, and I often with the thought of putting them in buildings. And that's back to that example. Okay, now, so that's the end of those pictures. Can I have the light again, please? Let's see now, what can I try and say? One of the things that I didn't mention about the structures, the deep structure that I was talking about before, I talked about the fact that it represents, if you want to call it that, wholeness, and it has this peculiar quality of corresponding somehow to the human self. I didn't really talk about feeling. There's a way in which building ultimately has to do with feeling. And although, again, everybody who deals with building knows that, because of the mistakes, what I believe are mistakes that we're making about these deep structures, that is because we do not recognize that this structure of wholeness is a real phenomenon, we actually exclude ourselves from the capacity to make feeling in buildings. Because when you work with the kind of structures that we have been accustomed to work with in the last 30 or 40 years, you specifically somehow exclude yourself from all real contact with human feeling. Now, I don't know why this has happened. I'm not quite sure what the psychiatry of it is or the sociology. Why the architecture that began in the 20s and 30s gradually took that direction more and more strongly. I think it really began to happen very strongly after the war. The early years of the modern movement, I think, still were quite strongly rooted in a real appreciation of human feeling. But essentially, the structures that have been produced since the war, I think, have been more and more alienated. And they have become alienated because of a refusal. I mean, I believe it's a specific and somehow almost intentional refusal. So that even the group of architects that one loosely calls these, what do you call, postmodern architects, who are sort of toying, I think, with the kinds of things that I'm speaking about. But somehow they manage to do it tongue-in-cheek all the time, because they actually don't want to make themselves vulnerable. They don't want to put real feeling on the line. They just want to kind of create this ornamental bullshit, but not actually get down to the real heart of the matter. And I think this is tremendously important. I say this, on the one hand, you say it's very important as an artist, of course, because that is the main thing that you're really trying to do. It's also very, very important from the cosmological point of view. That is, if I'm right that the phenomenon of wholeness in space is a real phenomenon, more or less corresponding to the structures that I've described, and essentially excluded by the contemporary picture that physics has given us, there's a very, very strange aspect of it, because somehow this structure connects up with human feeling. Now, why there should be a structure that's out there, in other words, an objective kind of structure, the unity of space, if I call it that very loosely, which for some reason is capable of penetrating human feeling, that poses questions of a cosmological sort that are quite extraordinary. I mean, it simply means that the nature of space as a neutral medium, as we have learned to understand it since the time of Newton and Descartes, is just plain wrong. And that the universe is not made of that kind of stuff. It's actually made of a kind of stuff, space, which for some reason has the capacity to draw wholeness into itself, and that when that wholeness appears in it, it for some reason makes contact with the human being and with human feeling. Now, I'm out of time, so I can't be even now try. If you wish, some of you might want to come and meet tomorrow morning. I believe there's some sort of a coffee and croissant type arrangement. We could speculate on what kind of thing is going on in the universe for space to have that nature. Because what it does is, once you begin to understand that correctly, again, correctly if I'm right, it drastically alters your whole sense of motivation as a builder or as an architect. In other words, the reason why you are doing something has to do with that kind of imperative of relating yourself to this peculiar substance that the universe is made of, and somehow drawing these holes out of it. And for some reason, those holes connect directly with the human being and with human feeling. In other words, this implies a connection between the outer world and the inner world, which is totally different from the impression that's been left us by contemporary physics. And my hope, maybe too far-fetched, is almost something like this. See, for the last 300 years, we've been getting everything. We've been getting our picture of the world from physics. Actually, those of us architects in the last few decades who've been trying to kind of get into tune with the times, we've taken our picture of the universe from physics very explicitly. I remember when I was doing my PhD here and I wanted to be methodological and I wanted to really think things out, I was constantly sort of borrowing the visions of physics and mathematics and so forth. It may actually be that the tables will be turned, that the kind of visions that I'm speaking about now, that what sort of substance space is, I'm not using space in the architectural sense, I'm talking about space, the stuff the universe is made of. The kind of visions about that, which may be generated from the inside of architecture for the sorts of reasons that I've been trying to explain tonight, might ultimately start to teach physics something about what is actually going on in this place we live in. Well, I think it's about time for supper, so thank you very much.